On the morning of April 7th, 1987, a chilling realization hit the Pentagon. 5 nuclear-powered ghosts had just materialized off the United States East Coast, undetected. They weren't just passing through, they were parked in the backyard of America's most vital naval bases, simulating coordinated wartime strikes. When reporters cornered President Ronald Reagan at a press conference to ask if he was worried, he offered a grimly ironic joke.
Well, what about those Russian submarines off the coast, Mr. President? Couldn't they ruin our day, too? What's going on there?
You're asking a civilian?
The mission was called Operation Atrina, a name entirely invented by Soviet intelligence to mean absolutely nothing, leaving no logical thread for spies to pull. This is the story of the day the Soviet Union tried to make the U.S. Navy helpless in its own backyard. Atrina would become a Soviet legend till this day, a flawless masterstroke of Cold War dominance. But legends are not exactly what they seem. To understand the terror of Operation Atrina, you have to understand the invisible shield it pierced. For decades, the United States dominated the deep ocean through SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. SOSUS was a classified network of hydrophone arrays laid across the ocean floor. By exploiting the deep sound channel, it could hear the propeller cavitation of noisy Soviet submarines from thousands of miles away. For any Soviet submarine leaving the Kola Peninsula, the route to the U.S. East Coast was brutally predictable. The ocean funnels them straight into one geographic choke point, the GIUK Gap. The GIUK Gap is the stretch of water between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. It is the only real gateway from the Soviet Arctic into the open Atlantic. NATO turned it into a wall of sound. SOSUS arrays were laid across the entire gap, backed by maritime patrol aircraft and attack submarines on standing patrol. The GIUK Gap was a kill zone. Every Soviet submarine that tried to slip through it was hunted, tracked, and cataloged. But in the 1980s, the shield cracked from the inside. The Walker spy ring handed the KGB America's submarine tracking secrets. Toshiba sold Moscow advanced CNC milling machines. Suddenly, Soviet propellers were ultra-smooth. The result was the Project 671 RTM Victor III, quieter than anything the Soviets had ever built. The Victor III was an attack submarine, roughly 7,000 tons, diving below 400 meters, carrying torpedoes and nuclear-tipped missiles. Its towed array pod on the tail listened for the enemy while the boat stayed silent. Moscow built Atrina for one purpose: to sail these new stealth machines to America's doorstep and prove that the era of U.S. acoustic dominance was over. First in March 1987, 5 Victor III attack submarines slipped out of Zapadnya Litsa Bay. The operation was wrapped in a lie. Soviet intelligence spread disinformation to make it look like the boats were heading to the Mediterranean. Instead, to bypass the SOSUS tripwires, the boats vanished under the Arctic ice, riding the western coast of Greenland down into the Atlantic. Their destination was the Sargasso Sea, a sunlit furnace in the western Atlantic. But why sail Arctic submarines into a tropical trap? The Soviets didn't pick these waters by accident. First, they were hunting the ultimate prize. In the 1980s, the U.S. Navy introduced the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, massive, ultra-stealthy vessels carrying nuclear deterrents. Soviet intelligence suspected the deep, expansive waters of the Sargasso Sea were a primary hiding spot for these boomers. Atrina was an expedition to locate these patrol areas and record their acoustic signatures. It was also a simulation for a doomsday strike. By parking 5 nuclear-armed submarines in this region, the Soviets were proving they could get within point-blank range of major U.S. naval hubs, like the sprawling base at Norfolk, Virginia. The environment itself was also a tactical test. The Sargasso Sea is characterized by complex thermal layers. These acoustic conditions create sound channels and shadow zones where submarines can effectively hide from sonar. The Soviets wanted to see if their newly quieted propellers could exploit these anomalies. Finally, they wanted to kick the hornet's nest. Bermuda, located squarely in the Sargasso Sea, was a massive hub for U.S. and British anti-submarine forces. Moscow intentionally drove their boats right into the teeth of NATO's surveillance network to measure exactly how long it would take the Americans to react. But the ocean itself was waiting to kill them. The Sargasso Sea presents severe thermal challenges. Water stays between 25 and 28 degrees Celsius all the way down. For a submarine packed tightly with early-generation digital processors, the ambient ocean can no longer cool the electronics. To make matters worse, dense mats of sargassum seaweed began clogging the seawater intakes. Inside the K-244, it was a sweat box. And the heat didn't just break the men, it broke the machines. Their secret weapon, the experimental RITSA acoustic computer, fried in the heat within 2 days, completely derailing their coordinated search tactics. Then, the division commander's submarine suffered a catastrophic communications malfunction. The K-244 was forced to act as the fleet's radio relay, forcing them to surface more frequently and drastically increasing their chances of being detected by NATO. While evading NATO sonar nets, a sailor developed acute appendicitis, forcing the ship's doctor to convert the wardroom into an operating room. Then another case, then a third. And, to make matters worse, while transiting blindly through the dark at 15 knots, the K-244 violently collided with an unknown underwater object. The impact caused the 5,000-ton submarine to shake like a splinter. The crew suspected the mangled remains of a massive whale were caught between their propeller blades, forcing the crippled submarine to limp onward with a vibrating shaft. The ocean wasn't just hiding the submarines, it was tearing them apart. Yet, against all odds, the Soviet crews refused to break. Limping on crippled hardware, they pushed through the gauntlet and successfully breached the American perimeter. For an entire month, they parked right off the U.S. East Coast, running simulated wartime attacks against major U.S. East Coast naval bases. They had achieved the impossible. According to the official archives in Moscow, Operation Atrina was a flawless masterstroke, a tactical checkmate that brought the West to its knees. The Soviet High Command claimed their steel phantoms slipped entirely through NATO's underwater tripwires. They arrived in the Sargasso Sea completely undetected, holding the American coast hostage. Admiral Vladimir Chernovin, the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy, called it a small battle of the Atlantic. He wrote that the operation fully accomplished its missions. American and British submarines deployed in the Atlantic were detected. The underwater and surface navigation situation was disclosed, and all Soviet submarines returned home safely. He added a touch of bravado, quote, "It was necessary to teach a little lesson to the arrogant probable enemy and show that if necessary we can become elusive avengers." To Moscow, the Victor IIIs had proven that the era of American acoustic superiority was over. 5 nuclear-armed attack submarines had breached the Atlantic and parked within cruise missile range of the U.S. East Coast. If war had come, they could have launched a devastating retribution strike. But as the Soviets basked in Cold War glory, the Americans had a very different story to tell. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy was telling a very different story. The Americans claimed they weren't ambushed at all. On April 7, 1987, the U.S. Navy announced that Soviet submarines were operating near Bermuda. The U.S. Atlantic Fleet scrambled virtually their entire anti-submarine force. Deck and shore-based aircraft surged into the sky. 3 Stalwart-class sonar surveillance ships deployed. 6 U.S. attack submarines joined the hunt. The British aircraft carrier HMS Invincible led a carrier group into the search area. Declassified accounts from the Pentagon assert that U.S. forces recognized the unprecedented sortie the moment the submarines left their Kola Peninsula bases. The U.S. Atlantic Fleet deployed a vast anti-submarine force to shadow the Victor IIIs continuously. Then Secretary of the Navy John Lehman said the Victor IIIs had coordinated their operations with Tu-20 Bear D reconnaissance and missile guidance aircraft flying from bases on the Kola Peninsula and from Cuba. He believed Moscow was testing U.S. surveillance and reaction capabilities. Americans mocked the Soviet effort, calling the deployment a rare bonanza for practicing wartime anti-submarine tactics on live hostile targets. But the American boasting hid a terrifying blind spot. In the chaos of the hunt, U.S. sonar operators misidentified one of the Victor IIIs as a strategic ballistic missile submarine. For a brief, agonizing window, the Pentagon didn't think they were tracking a tactical hunter. They thought a city-killing doomsday machine was parked point-blank off the East Coast. And there is a glaring contradiction in the American story. They claimed they saw everything and were entirely under control, yet they used increased Soviet activity like Atrina to justify funding for next-generation assets, the Seawolf and Virginia-class submarines, and the P-8 Poseidon. To this day, the true story of Operation Atrina is a classified paradox. Moscow claims absolute invisibility. Washington claims absolute surveillance. It was either a flawless ambush or a masterfully monitored trap. Neither side could afford to admit the truth. What is undeniable is that 5 nuclear-armed submarines had reached America's maritime doorstep, whether fully tracked or not, proving just how terrifyingly thin the margin of error the Cold War had become.